The instrument panel rattled as the number 3 engine coughed once, twice, then seized completely. Second Lieutenant Russell Phillips felt the B-24 Liberator lurch sideways, the propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream, creating drag that pulled the aircraft into a slow, sickening yaw. Phillips checked his watch. They were 3 hours out from Funafuti Atoll, searching for a downed crew somewhere in this endless expanse of Pacific Ocean. It was May 27, 1943. Phillips reached for the feathering button. The propeller blades rotated to reduce drag, but the damage was done. The B-24 they called Green Hornet had lost 1/4 of its power, and they were still 500 miles from home. In the co-pilot seat, Lieutenant Louis Zamperini watched the altimeter needle drop. They were descending. 2,000 feet, 1,800, 1,500. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was supposed to be the answer to the Pacific's tyranny of distance. When the United States Army Air Forces began operations across the Central Pacific in 1942, they faced a challenge no other Air Force had ever confronted. The distances were incomprehensible. From Hawaii to Wake Island, 2,100 miles. From the Marianas to Tokyo, 1,500 miles. And between these points, nothing. No emergency airfields, no friendly islands, just ocean. The B-24 was designed specifically for this environment. Its Davis wing, that distinctive high-shoulder mounted design, gave the aircraft a range the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress couldn't match. Maximum range on a high-altitude mission, nearly 1,600 miles, with modifications, stripping out armor and extra guns, replacing them with additional fuel tanks. That range could be pushed to 2,000 miles, maybe more, but range on paper and range in reality were different things. The specifications assumed 4 engines running smoothly at optimal cruise settings. They assumed no battle damage, no mechanical failures, no navigation errors, no headwinds. Combat flying in the Pacific violated every one of those assumptions. The B-24's 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines were reliable by the standards of 1943, but reliable didn't mean infallible. Each engine was a 14-cylinder, air-cooled radial producing 1,200 horsepower at takeoff, 1,200 horses driving a 3-bladed variable pitch propeller through a complex system of reduction gears, oil pumps, and superchargers, 1,200 moving parts that could fail. Engine failure over Europe meant trying to limp back to England, knowing that occupied France or the North Sea waited below if you couldn't make it. Engine failure over the Pacific meant something entirely different. Below was 2 miles of ocean. The nearest land might be 600 miles away. There were no prisoners of war camps to surrender to, no resistance networks to help evading airmen. There was water, and then more water, stretching to every horizon. By mid-1943, B-24 crews in the Pacific had learned what the aircraft could and couldn't do with engines out. The manual said a fully loaded B-24 could maintain altitude on 3 engines. That was technically true. If you were light on fuel and ammunition, if you reduced power on the remaining 3 engines to avoid overheating them, if you accepted that you'd be flying at reduced altitude and reduced speed. With 2 engines out, especially if they were on the same wing, maintaining altitude was nearly impossible. The asymmetric thrust would force the aircraft into a turn toward the dead engines. The pilots would fight this constantly, applying opposite rudder until their legs cramped, trimming the aircraft as best they could. But trim could only do so much. The drag from the windmilling or feathered propellers, combined with the loss of power, meant descent was inevitable. Some crews made it. In February 1943, a B-24 from the 11th Bombardment Squadron, flying out of Java, was shot up by Japanese fighters. 1 engine set on fire. Captain Theodore Swanson ordered his crew to parachute to an island below, then landed the damaged aircraft on a beach himself. He saved the plane's medical supplies and emergency rations. He received the Silver Star. Others weren't so fortunate. On June 6, 1942, 4 LB-30s, the export version of the B-24, attempted to attack Wake Island from bases in Hawaii. They couldn't find the target in the weather and had to turn back. The navigation error meant extra flying time, extra fuel consumed. One aircraft ran out of fuel 400 miles short of Hawaii and ditched in the ocean. No survivors. The mathematics of fuel consumption were brutal and unforgiving. A B-24D carried 2,400 gallons of fuel in its standard tanks. At normal cruise settings, the four engines consumed roughly 200 gallons per hour. That gave about 12 hours of endurance. But combat operations were never conducted at normal cruise. Takeoff required full power. Climbing to altitude burned extra fuel. Combat maneuvering, bomb runs, evasive action, all consumed fuel at accelerated rates. And if an engine failed, the remaining three had to work harder to maintain airspeed and altitude, burning more fuel per hour than they would have with all four operating normally. The flight engineers calculated these numbers obsessively. They kept detailed logs, fuel flow from each tank, engine temperatures, oil pressure, manifold pressure. They cross-referenced actual consumption against the how goes it charts, graphs showing predicted fuel usage against elapsed time. If actual consumption exceeded the chart, they knew trouble was coming. On long overwater missions, crews flew with virtually no reserve. Getting to the target and back to base might require 11.5 hours of the 12 hours total endurance. That left 30 minutes of margin, half an hour of fuel between landing safely and ditching in the Pacific. When Green Hornet's engine failed, Phillips and Zamperini had to make immediate calculations. They were searching for a downed aircraft, which meant they'd been deviating from the direct route back to Funafuti. How far off course were they? They didn't know exactly. The weather had been poor, navigation fixes had been intermittent. Could they make it back on 3 engines? The numbers were marginal. They'd been airborne for several hours already. Fuel state was unknown. The fuel gauge readings were unreliable on Green Hornet. The aircraft had been through multiple combat missions. Systems were worn. Nothing worked quite right. Phillips held altitude as long as he could, nursing the 3 remaining engines, adjusting the mixture, adjusting the propeller pitch, trying to find the sweet spot where they burned the least fuel while maintaining airspeed. But physics was unforgiving. With one engine out, drag increased, power decreased. The aircraft wanted to descend. At 1,000 feet altitude, Phillips had to accept reality. They weren't going to make it. The Pacific stretched endlessly below them. Dark, blue water. Whitecaps visible in the afternoon sun. No ships, no islands, no hope of rescue except the 2 small life rafts stowed in the aircraft. The B-24's ditching characteristics were poor. The high-mounted Davis wing meant the aircraft sat high on the fuselage. When it hit water, the fuselage would act like a shovel, digging into the sea. The impact would be violent. The aircraft would likely break apart. Crew survival depended on getting out before it sank, and B-24s sank fast, maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. Phillips ordered the crew to crash positions. 10 men in the aircraft, not counting Phillips and Zamperini in the cockpit. They strapped into seats, braced themselves. Some prayed, some went silent. Zamperini felt a strange calm settle over him. He'd competed in the Olympics in Berlin in 1936 as a miler. He'd faced pressure before, but nothing like this. The water came up fast. Phillips tried to level the aircraft, tried to stall it just above the surface so it would belly in flat, but altitude and airspeed were difficult to judge over featureless ocean. The B-24 hit hard. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage broke in half just aft of the wing. Water rushed in instantly. 8 men died on impact or drowned in the wreckage within seconds. Zamperini found himself tangled in cables and wires, pulled underwater as the aircraft sank. He fought free. His lungs were burning. He kicked toward light. He broke the surface, gasping. The aircraft was gone. Already 2 miles deep. Phillips was there, and the tail gunner, Francis McNamara, 3 survivors out of 11 men. They found 2 life rafts floating in the debris field, yellow rubber equipped with emergency supplies, a few chocolate bars, some tins of water. They were somewhere south of Hawaii. The exact position was unknown. They had no radio, no way to signal for help. The search aircraft looking for them would be searching hundreds of square miles of empty ocean. The chances of being spotted were minuscule. Zamperini took charge. He rationed the food and water immediately. 1 bite of chocolate in the morning, 1 bite in the evening, a few sips of water per day. They'd need to make supplies last as long as possible. Sharks began circling the rafts within hours. The 3 men could see them just below the surface, could reach out and touch them. This was the reality behind the statistics. The United States Army Air Forces lost thousands of aircraft in the Pacific Theater between 1942 and 1945. Many crashed on missions, many were shot down, but many simply disappeared, listed as missing, lost at sea, fuel exhaustion, engine failure, navigation error, mechanical malfunction. The ocean swallowed them without trace. Every B-24 crew flying over the Pacifics knew this. They knew the aircraft's limitations. They knew the distances they were being asked to fly. They knew that survival depended on everything working perfectly, and they knew from experience that nothing ever worked perfectly. Yet, they flew anyway, mission after mission, across distances that seemed impossible, over water that offered no second chances. They flew because the war demanded it, because the Japanese bases, scattered across the Pacific, had to be bombed, because the convoys had to be attacked, because intelligence photos had to be taken. Some missions stretched the B-24 to its absolute limits. In the China-Burma-India theater, B-24s flew supplies over the Himalayas, a route called the Hump. These flights required crossing mountains over 20,000 feet high, in weather that grounded every other aircraft, carrying loads that pushed the B-24's weight to its structural limits. The C-87, the cargo version of the B-24, was notorious in this role. Crews complained constantly about fuel system problems. Leaks were common. Mid-air fires were a constant danger. The aircraft wasn't designed for the mission it was being asked to perform, but it was the only aircraft available that could carry enough cargo at high enough altitude to make the route viable. In the Central Pacific, B-24s flew from tiny island bases against Japanese-held atolls hundreds of miles away. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Truk. These missions required precise navigation. Miss the target island by even a few degrees, and you'd fly past it, never seeing it, burning fuel, searching until you had to turn back, hoping you had enough to make it home. In the Southwest Pacific, B-24s flew under the control of General Douglas MacArthur and General George Kenney. The 5th Air Force used Liberators to isolate Japanese bases, to sink Japanese shipping, to provide reconnaissance of enemy movements. The missions grew longer as American forces pushed north. By 1944, B-24s were flying 2,400-mile round trips, 12 hours in the air, sometimes more. The crews became experts in long-range cruise control. The flight engineers developed techniques to squeeze every possible mile from their fuel. They leaned the mixture to the edge of engine roughness, then enriched it just slightly. They adjusted propeller pitch constantly, finding the most efficient RPM for each flight condition. They transferred fuel between tanks to maintain proper aircraft balance while ensuring the engines always had fuel to burn. These techniques worked most of the time, but the Pacific was unforgiving of mistakes. In August 1945, a C-87 Liberator Express ran out of fuel 500 miles northeast of Honolulu while flying from Hawaii to California. The crew had failed to verify the aircraft was properly fueled before departure. The aircraft ditched. 18 people died. 8 survived on life rafts. The survivors floated for days before being rescued. Search vessels covered hundreds of square miles looking for them. 7 ships participated, including aircraft carriers. The search was massive because the crash position was only approximately known. The Pacific was large enough to hide anything smaller than an island. That was the constant background fear for every B-24 crew, not being shot down in combat. Though that was frightening enough, but simply being lost, running out of fuel, ditching, floating in a raft, watching the horizon for rescue planes that might never come. Some did come. The Air Sea Rescue Service, equipped with PBY Catalina flying boats and submarines stationed along flight routes, saved hundreds of downed airmen during the war, but they could only rescue crews they could find, and finding a tiny raft in the vastness of the Pacific required luck as much as skill. Zamperini, Phillips, and McNamara drifted for 47 days. McNamara died on day 33. The other two survived on rainwater when they could collect it. On birds they managed to catch, on fish they grabbed from sharks. They drifted over 2,000 miles before being captured by the Japanese in the Marshall Islands. Their survival was extraordinary, but it illustrated what B-24 crews faced when their aircraft failed them over the Pacific. The ocean showed no mercy. Survival required not just skill and preparation, but luck, tremendous luck. And yet, despite all this, most crews made it. Most missions were successful. The B-24s kept flying. They kept striking their targets. They kept the pressure on Japanese forces across thousands of miles of ocean. The statistics tell the story. Over 18,000 B-24s were built during the war. They flew hundreds of thousands of missions. The loss rates, while significant, were manageable. But behind every statistic was a crew. 10 men per aircraft. Men who knew the risks, who understood that engine failure 400 miles from base meant decisions with life or death consequences, who climbed into their aircraft anyway and flew into that vast blue emptiness, trusting their training, their aircraft, and each other. The title of this story asks whether one B-24 crew flew home on 2 engines across 800 miles of ocean. The historical record is filled with crews who attempted exactly these kinds of desperate flights. Some made it, many didn't. What's certain is that the men who flew B-24 Liberators across the Pacific during World War II faced challenges that tested the absolute limits of their aircraft and themselves. They flew farther than anyone thought possible, over terrain more hostile than any battlefield, knowing that one engine failure, one navigation error, one fuel miscalculation could strand them in an ocean that stretched beyond imagination. The B-24 Liberator's reputation in the Pacific theater was built on missions that pushed the boundaries of what 4-engine bombers could accomplish. But the aircraft's greatest tests came not from enemy action, but from the simple, brutal physics of flight over water. Understanding what B-24 crews could achieve with damaged aircraft requires understanding what the aircraft was designed to do when everything worked correctly. The Liberator was engineered around the Davis wing, a high aspect ratio design that provided exceptional lift-to-drag characteristics. This wing allowed the B-24 to fly farther and faster than the B-17 Flying Fortress, carrying a heavier bomb load while consuming roughly the same amount of fuel. But that efficiency came with trade-offs. The Davis wing was sensitive to ice formation. In cold weather, ice would accumulate on the leading edges, disrupting the airflow, destroying the wing's efficiency. Pilots complained that the wing wouldn't hold enough ice to chill a drink. More seriously, battle damage to the wing was catastrophic. The high wing loading meant that holes in the wing surface caused critical loss of lift. A B-17 could limp home with significant wing damage. A B-24 with similar damage often couldn't maintain altitude. The fuel system was another vulnerability. The wing's internal structure created large fuel tanks, which gave the B-24 its impressive range. But these tanks were prone to leaking. Even with self-sealing technology, which closed bullet holes automatically, the system wasn't perfect. Fuel leaks meant not just lost range, but fire risk. Aviation gasoline vapors in the confined spaces of the wing could ignite from a single spark. Engine outperformance depended critically on which engines failed and how quickly the crew responded. The B-24's 4 engines were numbered 1 through 4 from left to right. Losing an outboard engine, number 1 or number 4, was manageable. The asymmetric thrust wasn't overwhelming. Pilots could trim the aircraft to fly nearly hands-off, though they'd lose altitude slowly and burn extra fuel. Losing an inboard engine, number 2 or number 3, was more serious. These engines sat closer to the fuselage. Their failure created less asymmetric thrust, which sounds beneficial, but they also contributed more to the aircraft's overall performance. The power loss was more significant. The worst scenario was losing both engines on one wing. The asymmetric thrust became nearly impossible to control. The dead wing wanted to drop. The aircraft would roll toward the failed engines. Full opposite aileron and rudder might not be enough to maintain level flight. Some crews, who lost both engines on one wing, managed to keep flying by accepting a constant shallow bank. Others couldn't control the aircraft at all and had to bail out or ditch immediately. Flight engineers trained extensively on engine-out procedures. When an engine failed, the sequence was critical. First, identify which engine had failed. This sounds obvious, but in combat, with multiple things happening simultaneously, crews sometimes shut down the wrong engine, compounding the emergency. The failed engine would be obvious from the instruments: oil pressure dropping, cylinder head temperature falling, RPM decreasing. But visual confirmation was important. Second, feather the propeller immediately. The feathering mechanism rotated the propeller blades to align with the airflow, minimizing drag. An unfeathered propeller on a dead engine would windmill in the slipstream, creating enormous drag. Some B-24s lost over the Pacific went down because propeller feathering mechanisms failed. The crew couldn't reduce the drag, couldn't maintain altitude, couldn't reach home. Third, secure the engine. Close the fuel shutoff valve. Close the oil shutoff valve. Ensure the engine's magnetos were off. An engine fire was always possible even after shutdown. Crews carried fire extinguisher systems, but these were limited. If an engine fire couldn't be controlled, the crew had minutes before it spread to the fuel tanks. Fourth, adjust the remaining engines. The 3 good engines had to produce more power to compensate for the lost engine. But they couldn't simply be pushed to maximum power. Running engines at full power continuously would overheat them, potentially causing additional failures. The flight engineer had to find the balance. Enough power to maintain altitude and airspeed, not so much that the engines destroyed themselves. Fifth, redistribute fuel. With one engine shut down, fuel consumption decreased slightly, but fuel distribution became critical. The B-24's fuel system allowed transfer between tanks. If fuel weight became unbalanced, the aircraft would want to roll toward the heavy wing. Keeping the aircraft balanced reduced the control inputs needed from the pilots, reduced fatigue, and improved efficiency. All of this had to happen while the aircraft was potentially under attack, while wounded crew members needed attention, while the navigator calculated new headings to the nearest friendly base, while the radio operator attempted to send distress signals. The historical record contains numerous examples of B-24 crews executing these procedures successfully. In April 1944, a B-24H, designated Nancy Jane II, was damaged by flak over Vienna and Graz. Flying back toward the Adriatic island of Vis, the crew lost power in one engine and experienced problems with another. The pilot concluded they couldn't make Vis and decided to ditch on enemy territory rather than risk flying over water with failing engines. The crew survived the ditching. In other cases, crews chose to risk the water crossing. The calculation was simple. Ditching on enemy territory meant capture. Japanese treatment of captured American airmen was brutal. Many were executed. Others were sent to prisoner of war camps where conditions were horrific. Given the choice between a difficult flight over water and certain capture, many crews chose the water. The 7th Air Force, operating from bases in the Central Pacific, faced these choices regularly. Their B-24s flew from Hawaii to Wake Island, from the Marianas to Japan, from Palau to the Philippines. Every mission crossed hundreds of miles of ocean. Engine failures were common. Battle damage was frequent. Yet, the missions continued. In June 1945, the 494th Bombardment Group became the first B-24 unit to operate from Okinawa against the Japanese home islands. These missions flew over the East China Sea, a body of water known for violent weather and strong currents. A crew ditching there had limited survival prospects. Search and rescue assets were stretched thin. The Japanese Navy still operated in the area, yet the group flew mission after mission. The mathematical reality of two-engine flight over long distances was harsh. A B-24 could theoretically fly on 2 engines if they were properly balanced, one on each wing. But maintaining altitude was nearly impossible. The aircraft would descend slowly, perhaps 50 feet per minute, perhaps more. Over an 800-mile flight, that descent would take the aircraft from cruising altitude to sea level long before reaching safety. Some crews attempted to extend their range by descending deliberately, trading altitude for distance. At lower altitudes, the air was denser, the engines produced slightly more power. But this advantage was minimal and came with risks. Lower altitude meant higher fuel consumption. It also meant less time to react if another emergency occurred. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The successful flights, the ones where crews made it home against impossible odds, shared common factors. First, the crew remained calm. Panic was fatal. Every action had to be deliberate, thought through, executed correctly. Second, the flight engineer's skill was critical. Managing fuel, managing engines, calculating range, all required expertise and experience. Third, the navigator had to provide accurate headings. Being even a few degrees off course over hundreds of miles meant missing the destination entirely. Fourth, luck played a role. Weather had to cooperate. The remaining engines had to keep running. The aircraft structure had to hold together. The B-24 crews who survived these ordeals rarely spoke about them as heroic achievements. They described their actions matter-of-factly. The engine failed, they followed procedures, they made it back. Or they didn't. The tone was almost clinical, as if discussing a routine mechanical problem rather than a life-or-death struggle. This attitude reflected their training and their era. The generation that fought World War II had grown up during the Great Depression. They were accustomed to hardship, to making do with limited resources, to solving problems without complaint. Flying a damaged bomber across the Pacific was simply another problem to solve. But the physical and mental demands were extraordinary. Pilots flying with engines out had to maintain constant pressure on the rudder pedals to counteract asymmetric thrust. After several hours, their legs would cramp. They'd switch control with the co-pilot, but both pilots would be exhausted by the time they reached base. Landing a damaged aircraft required precision. No margin for error remained. The flight engineers monitored gauges continuously, watching for any indication of additional problems: oil pressure fluctuations, unusual temperature readings, vibrations. Any of these could signal impending failure. They couldn't relax until the aircraft was safely on the ground. Navigators worked their calculations repeatedly, cross-checking positions, taking celestial fixes when possible, using dead reckoning when clouds obscured the stars. In the Pacific, navigation errors of even a few miles could be fatal. Islands were tiny targets in vast ocean. Miss your destination and you might fly on until fuel exhaustion with nowhere to land. The psychological strain was immense. Every man aboard knew that their survival depended on systems continuing to function, on calculations being correct, on luck holding. The knowledge that ditching meant probable death concentrated minds wonderfully. Crews worked together with absolute focus, each man performing his duties while trusting others to perform theirs. This trust was built through training and combat experience. B-24 crews trained together for months before deploying overseas. They learned each other's capabilities, quirks, and limits. They knew who would remain calm under pressure, who might panic, who could be relied upon in crisis. Combat strengthened these bonds. Crews who survived multiple missions together developed almost telepathic understanding. When Louis Zamperini and Russell Phillips found themselves floating in rafts after Green Hornet crashed, they survived in part because of this bond. They trusted each other, they worked together to catch birds, to collect rainwater, to fight off sharks. When McNamara died, Phillips and Zamperini continued supporting each other. That partnership kept them alive until Japanese capture. Their story became famous through Laura Hillenbrand's book, Unbroken, published in 2010. But thousands of similar stories existed. Crews who ditched and weren't found, crews who died of exposure in rafts, crews who were strafed by Japanese fighters while helpless in the water. The Pacific kept its secrets. The Air Sea Rescue Service did what it could. PBY Catalinas Slow but reliable flying boats patrolled likely crash areas. Submarines were positioned along bomber routes to rescue downed crews. Surface ships responded to distress calls when possible, but the Pacific was simply too large. Even with dedicated rescue assets, the chances of finding a specific raft in thousands of square miles of ocean were minimal. This reality influenced crew decision-making. When faced with engine failures far from base, crews had to choose. Attempt to make it home, knowing that ditching far from base meant almost no rescue prospects, divert to a closer base, even if it meant flying toward enemy territory, bail out over a known island, even if that island was Japanese-held. Different crews made different choices based on circumstances. Combat-damaged aircraft might be losing fuel or might have other systems failing. In those cases, getting the aircraft on the ground quickly anywhere was the priority, but aircraft with simple engine failures, where the structure was sound and fuel sufficient, could attempt longer flights. The 380th Bombardment Group, operating with the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, regularly flew missions requiring extraordinary range. Based initially in Australia, later in the Philippines, they attacked targets in the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, and New Guinea. These missions covered over 2,000 miles round trip. Engine failures on these missions left crews hundreds of miles from friendly territory. Group records document multiple instances of aircraft returning on 3 engines, sometimes on 2. The specific details varied. Some aircraft barely made it, landing with nearly empty fuel tanks. Others had sufficient reserve that they could have continued flying, but all shared the common element of crew skill and determination. The 13th Air Force, operating in the South Pacific, faced similar challenges. Their B-24s flew from bases in the Solomon Islands, later from the Admiralty Islands and the Philippines. Missions against bypassed Japanese garrisons required long overwater flights with no alternate landing sites. Crews learned to trust their aircraft and themselves. By war's end in August 1945, B-24 Liberators had flown hundreds of thousands of missions across the Pacific. They'd bombed Japanese bases from the Kuriles to Java. They'd sunk Japanese ships from the Philippines to the East China Sea. They'd photographed enemy installations, dropped supplies to resistance fighters, evacuated wounded soldiers, and performed countless other missions. The aircraft that survived were quickly retired. The B-24 was obsolete almost as soon as the war ended. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was superior in every meaningful way. Thousands of Liberators were flown to desert storage facilities and scrapped. Brand new B-24s, built in the war's final months, never saw combat. They went directly from the factory to the scrapyard. Only a handful of B-24s survive today in museums and with restoration groups. These aircraft serve as reminders of what their crews accomplished. But no static display can capture the reality of flying over the Pacific in 1943 or 44 or 45. The distances, the isolation, the constant mechanical challenges, the ever-present possibility of engine failure far from help. The title of this story asks about one crew flying home on 2 engines across 800 miles of ocean. The historical truth is that numerous crews attempted such flights. Some succeeded through skill, preparation, and luck. Others failed, their names recorded on memorial walls listing those lost at sea. What matters isn't whether one specific flight matches the exact parameters of the title. What matters is understanding what B-24 crews in the Pacific faced routinely. They flew aircraft pushed to their limits across distances that seemed impossible. When engines failed, they didn't give up. They calculated. They adjusted. They fought to bring their aircraft and their crews home. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes the ocean claimed them. But they never stopped trying. That determination, that refusal to accept defeat, even when circumstances seemed hopeless, defined the B-24 crews who fought across the Pacific. They were ordinary men facing extraordinary challenges, doing extraordinary things because the mission demanded it. Their legacy endures not in the few surviving aircraft, but in the example they set. When faced with impossible situations, when every rational calculation said failure was certain, they kept flying Anyway, they kept their engines running, kept their navigation accurate, kept their crews together, and often enough, against all odds, they made it home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.